I remember the exact moment my world shifted, the kind of betrayal that punches you in the gut so hard you can barely breathe, leaving you wondering if you were ever truly loved or just a convenient afterthought in someone else's priorities. I had been engaged to Alex for almost a year, and every extra dollar I made had gone straight into our wedding fund, a careful nest egg built with patience, sacrifice, and the excitement of building a future together. We had big dreams, not extravagant, not excessive, just a beautiful day surrounded by people who were supposed to love and support us. I had imagined my mother sitting front row, beaming with pride as I walked down the aisle, believing that no matter how complicated our relationship had been, she would still be happy for me. That illusion shattered the second I stepped into her house that evening, full of excitement, carrying my wedding planner and a list of final vendors I wanted to book before the prices jumped. My mother, Evelyn, sat stiffly at the kitchen table, her hands folded too neatly, her eyes refusing to meet mine, the way a child looks when they know they've done something terribly wrong but refuse to admit it. The air in the house felt thick, almost suffocating, and for the first time in a long while, my instincts screamed at me that something was terribly, terribly off. Mom? I set my bag down and moved closer, trying to shake the unease growing in my chest. What's wrong? She hesitated, took a slow sip from the mug in front of her, and then exhaled like she was preparing for a conversation she had already decided would end badly. Sarah, she said carefully, her voice carrying that calculated softness she only used when she wanted to manipulate a situation, we need to talk about the wedding fund. I blinked, confusion pushing aside my unease for just a moment. The fund? I laughed lightly, shaking my head. Mom, you're not going to believe this. I finally found a caterer that won't completely drain our budget, and Alex found a venue that's. I gave the money to Mark, she said, cutting me off as if the words weren't a knife to my chest, as if they were as casual as talking about the weather. The room seemed to shrink around me. My heart stuttered, then pounded so hard in my ears that I almost didn't register what she had just said. Almost. You, what? My voice barely came out, a breathless whisper that didn't feel like my own. She lifted her chin slightly, as if daring me to challenge her decision. Mark needed it more than you did, sweetheart, she continued, her tone infuriatingly calm, like she was explaining something completely rational to a child too young to understand. He's trying to get his business off the ground, and you know how hard it is for a man to succeed these days. The words didn't fully compute at first, like my brain refused to process the sheer level of betrayal that had just unfolded before me. I forced myself to swallow, to take a steadying breath even as I felt my entire body shake. You took my wedding fund, I said slowly, making sure I wasn't somehow misunderstanding, and gave it to Mark? She sighed heavily, shaking her head like I was the unreasonable one. Sarah, you're going to be fine. You have Alex, and eventually, his income will support you.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Mark doesn't have that. He needs a chance, and I wasn't about to sit back and let him struggle when I had the ability to help. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That wasn't yours to give, Mom, I snapped, my voice finally regaining some of its strength. That was my money, my future, my goddamn wedding. Watch your tone, she said sharply, her motherly authority slipping into place as if she had the right to reprimand me when she had just stolen from me. I raised you better than to be selfish. Selfish? I let out a short, humorless laugh, feeling the first pricks of hot, stinging tears behind my eyes. You just stole thousands of dollars from your own daughter and gave it to your golden boy, and I'm the selfish one? She scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, don't be dramatic, Sarah. A wedding is one day. Mark's business is his entire future. You'll land on your feet, you always do. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails bit into my palms, the pain grounding me just enough to keep me from losing it entirely. I had always known my mother favored Mark, always known she saw him as the one who needed to be protected, coddled, supported at any cost. But this? This was beyond favoritism. This was a declaration that I didn't matter. that my dreams were disposable the moment my brother needed something more. I should have known, I should have expected it, but some foolish, naive part of me had still believed that when it came to something as important as my wedding, my mother would do the right thing. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my mother. I saw a woman who had made a choice, who had chosen my brother, again and again, no matter the cost, no matter who she hurt in the process. I took a slow, shaky breath and straightened my shoulders. "You have no idea what you've just done," I said, my voice eerily calm now, the fire in my chest burning cold. She gave a dismissive wave. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Sarah." I didn't argue. I just turned around, grabbed my bag, and walked out. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for her to reconsider, because in that moment I knew there was no point. But deep down, beneath the shock, beneath the heartbreak, something else began to take root. Something dark. Something patient. Something that whispered, "She will regret this." I sat in the quiet of our small apartment, staring at the empty wedding planner in front of me, feeling like a part of my life had been ripped away without warning or apology. I had spent years dreaming of this moment, carefully saving every extra cent, cutting corners where I could, doing everything possible to ensure that Alex and I could have the wedding we wanted without taking on any unnecessary financial burden. I had envisioned my dress, the flowers, the music, the way it would all come together to mark the beginning of something beautiful, something solid, something that was ours. Now, in the space of one conversation, my mother had taken all of that away as if it meant nothing, as if my happiness was a trivial thing she could barter in exchange for my brother's convenience. Alex sat across from me, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching me with the kind of quiet patience that had always been one of his best qualities. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with empty words, wasn't the kind who tried to fix things that couldn't be fixed. Instead, he just let me sit with my anger, let me feel it fully before speaking. "You know we'll be fine, right?" His voice was soft but steady, the kind of tone that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. "We don't need a big wedding, Sarah. We just need us." I knew he was right. I had known it the moment I walked out of my mother's house, but that didn't make the betrayal hurt any less, didn't erase the feeling of being discarded like I was nothing more than an afterthought. Still, sitting there, looking at the man who had stood by me through everything, I knew that what we had was worth more than any venue, any expensive dress, any catered meal. So, we started over. Instead of the grand ceremony I had once imagined, we planned a small, intimate gathering with only our closest friends and the family members who truly cared about us. We booked a local restaurant for the reception, nothing fancy, nothing over the top, just good food and good company. My dress was simple but beautiful, a second-hand find that fit like it had been made for me. Alex's suit was one he had owned for years, tailored just enough to make it feel new again. We exchanged vows under the soft glow of string lights in the backyard of a friend's home, and in that moment, I knew that I hadn't lost anything that truly mattered. My mother didn't come. She didn't call, didn't send a message, didn't acknowledge the day in any way. It didn't surprise me. I knew how she operated, knew that she would frame herself as the victim in all of this, convincing herself that my refusal to simply accept her actions with a smile made me the ungrateful one. Mark didn't come either, though that was hardly unexpected. He was too busy, too focused on his new business, the one that had been funded with the money stolen from me. I didn't think about him, not for a long time. But then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment to twist the knife, I started hearing whispers. Mark's business wasn't doing well. At first, it was little things, a delayed launch, a few unexpected expenses, some minor setbacks that any new venture might experience. But then, the whispers turned into something louder, something impossible to ignore. Mark had no idea what he was doing. He had taken the money, dumped it into a half-baked idea with no real strategy, no proper planning, nothing but blind confidence and the expectation that everything would magically fall into place. And it wasn't working. Vendors weren't getting paid. Customers weren't showing up. The people he had hired were quitting, one by one, as the reality of his incompetence became more apparent. And still, despite everything, my mother refused to see the truth. "He just needs more time," she said when I finally broke down and called her, more out of morbid curiosity than any real concern. "Businesses take a while to become profitable. He's doing his best." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of it all. "Mom, he doesn't have a clue what he's doing," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "He blew through my wedding fund in less than a year, and now he's drowning and you're still making excuses for him? He's your brother," she snapped, as if that was supposed to mean something, as if those words alone should be enough to erase everything he had done, everything she had done. "And if you had any sense of family, you would be helping him, not sitting back and waiting for him to fail." The sheer irony of her words nearly knocked the wind out of me. "Help him?" I repeated, my disbelief curling into something dangerously close to laughter. "The way you helped me?" Silence. She didn't have an answer for that, and for once, I didn't give her time to come up with one. I hung up the phone, and for the first time in my life, I felt something shift inside me, something harden in a way that I knew was permanent. My mother had made her choice, and Mark had made his. Now, they would have to live with it. I had always known, deep down in the part of me that never wanted to admit it, that Mark would never succeed, not because he wasn't capable, but because he had never been forced to learn the hard lessons that the rest of us had to figure out on our own. He had never been held accountable for his mistakes, never been expected to take responsibility for the things he ruined, and never once had to face the consequences of his reckless decisions because my mother had always been there, waiting in the wings, ready to clean up his messes and convince him that the world was simply out to get him. When he took my wedding fund and poured it into his so-called business venture, I had known with absolute certainty that it would end in disaster, because Mark was not the kind of man who built things. He was the kind of man who burned them to the ground and then stood in the ashes, wondering why the fire hadn't spared him. It took less than a year for everything to fall apart, though I had expected it to happen even sooner. At first, he made excuses, claiming that the market was tougher than he anticipated, that customers were hesitant to take a chance on something new, that suppliers were unreliable, and that competitors were playing dirty to keep him from succeeding. He had an excuse for everything, and my mother, true to form, believed every single word, standing by his side like a loyal soldier, refusing to acknowledge the very obvious truth that her precious son was in over his head and had no idea how to run a business. I watched from a distance, never saying a word, never offering my opinion, never gloating as his empire crumbled beneath him, because I knew it wouldn't matter. My mother would never allow him to take the blame, and Mark would never take a long, hard look in the mirror and accept that maybe, just maybe, he had done this to himself. It wasn't in his nature to accept fault. It wasn't in my mother's nature to let him. When he finally hit rock bottom, when the debts had piled too high and the business had finally suffocated beneath the weight of his own incompetence, my mother did what she always did. She came to me, not with an apology, not with a recognition of the fact that she had stolen from me to prop up a man who had no idea what to do with the help he had been given, but with a demand disguised as a plea, another request that I put myself aside for the sake of the family, another expectation that I step in to save a man who had done absolutely nothing to deserve saving. "You need to help him, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying that same sharp authority she had used when I was a child, as if she still had the right to tell me what to do, as if I still owed her something after everything she had done to me. "He just needs more time, just a little bit of financial help to get back on his feet, and then everything will be fine again." I stared at her, feeling something close to amusement, something dangerously close to pity, something I couldn't quite name but knew wasn't love. "Mom, he wasted the money you gave him," I said, keeping my voice even, controlled, refusing to let her see that even after all these years, she still had the ability to make me angry. "He didn't have a plan, he didn't know what he was doing, and now he's buried himself so deep in debt that there's no way out. What exactly do you think I'm supposed to do about that?" She scoffed, shaking her head in disappointment, as if I were the one who had let her down, as if I were the failure in this scenario and not the son she had chosen to throw all her resources at. "You have the money," she said, as if that was reason enough, as if the simple fact that I had worked hard and built a life for myself meant that I now had a moral obligation to take care of the brother who had never once done a damn thing for me. "You're financially stable, you and Alex have a good life, and Mark isn't asking for much, just enough to help him through this rough patch." I laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because the sheer absurdity of it all was too much to take seriously. "A rough patch?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Mom, he took thousands of dollars and flushed it down the drain because he thought he was too good to work for someone else, because he wanted to be the boss without actually knowing what the hell he was doing. He didn't hit a rough patch, he created his own disaster, and now you want me to clean up after him?" Her expression hardened, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing in that way they always did when she realized she wasn't going to get what she wanted. "If you don't help him, don't expect help from me when you need it," she snapped, her voice dripping with the kind of venom that had once sent a younger version of me scrambling to make things right. To earn back the love and approval she dangled like a prize just out of reach. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I smiled then, slow and deliberate, letting the silence stretch between us just long enough for her to feel it, just long enough for her to realize that the power she had once wielded over me was gone. "I don't think that's going to be a problem," I said finally, my voice calm, collected, steady in a way that I knew would infuriate her. "Because unlike Mark, I don't make stupid decisions and expect other people to fix them for me." I watched as her face twisted, as the reality of the situation finally began to set in, as she realized that I was not the same daughter she had once controlled with guilt and obligation, that I was not going to be the safety net she had come to expect me to be. She opened her mouth to say something else, to try again, to push one last time, but I was already standing, already grabbing my purse, already walking toward the door with my head held high and my heart light in a way it hadn't been in years. I didn't look back when I left, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing if she had gotten to me, didn't let myself hesitate even for a second, because I knew this was the moment that truly changed everything. I had spent my entire life trying to prove to her that I was worth just as much as Mark, that I was just as deserving of her love, her respect, her support, but I finally saw the truth for what it was. She was never going to see me that way. Never going to admit that she had been wrong, never going to give me what I had spent my entire life chasing. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care. Years passed in the way that time always does, indifferent and relentless, moving forward whether we were ready for it or not. Alex and I built the kind of life we had always dreamed of, the kind of life that came from hard work, careful planning, and the unwavering commitment to never taking anything for granted. We bought a house in a quiet but beautiful neighborhood, nothing extravagant or flashy, just a place that felt safe and warm, a place that belonged to us in a way that nothing ever had before. We traveled when we could, built careers that gave us stability, and surrounded ourselves with people who added to our lives rather than drained us of energy, people who knew the meaning of loyalty and love, people who didn't see relationships as something transactional. Meanwhile, Mark's life became a series of predictable disasters, one failure bleeding into the next, each mistake compounding until it seemed like he no longer had a clear path forward, only a long trail of bad choices and burned bridges. The business he had poured my stolen wedding fund into was long gone, swallowed up by debt collectors and lawsuits, leaving him with nothing but a damaged reputation and a long list of people who would never trust him again. He tried new ventures, each one more ill-advised than the last, clinging to the delusion that he was destined for greatness despite having done nothing to earn it. He borrowed money from friends, from acquaintances, from anyone foolish enough to believe that he would ever pay them back, until eventually, even the most naive among them realized that Mark's promises were as empty as the bank account he refused to manage responsibly. Through it all, my mother refused to see the truth that had been staring her in the face for years, the truth that the rest of us had known long before she ever acknowledged it. Mark was never going to change because he had never been forced to. She made excuses for him the way she always had, weaving new stories of misfortune and injustice, painting him as the victim of a world that simply refused to give him a fair chance. Whenever his debts caught up with him, whenever another one of his businesses collapsed under the weight of his incompetence, she found a way to justify it, to reframe the failure as something temporary, something unfair, something that could be fixed if only the right opportunity presented itself. I kept my distance, not out of bitterness or lingering anger, but out of self-preservation, because I had learned long ago that my mother's love was conditional and that Mark's problems were never-ending. I answered her calls when she made them, visited on holidays when it felt necessary, but I never allowed myself to be pulled back into the cycle of guilt and obligation that had defined so much of my life before. When she spoke about Mark, I listened politely, offering no sympathy, no encouragement, no sign that I was willing to re-enter the role she had once expected me to play. She must have sensed the shift in me, must have realized that I was no longer the daughter who would bend to her will, because eventually, she stopped asking me to help him. And then, everything changed. The first time she mentioned the doctor's visits, she made it seem like it was nothing serious, just routine checkups, something she had been putting off but finally decided to take care of. She waved off my concern, telling me that she was fine, that she had always been strong, that there was no reason to worry. But the next time we spoke, her voice was different, thinner, weaker, carrying the weight of something unspoken, something heavy. It wasn't long before the truth came out. She was sick, sicker than she had let on, sicker than she wanted to admit even to herself. The diagnosis was devastating, the kind of news that forced you to confront your own mortality, the kind of news that stripped away all illusions of control. She needed treatment, aggressive and immediate, and the cost was staggering, a number so high that even someone financially stable would have struggled to manage it alone. She had insurance, but it wasn't enough, and the bills were piling up faster than she could handle, draining what little savings she had left. I knew what was coming before she ever said the words, could hear it in the hesitation, in the forced lightness of her tone, in the way she danced around the subject as if she could trick me into offering before she had to ask. "I hate to even bring this up, sweetheart," she said one evening, her voice careful, calculated in that way I had heard 100 times before. "You know I would never ask if I had any other choice, but things are just really difficult right now. The hospital bills are overwhelming, and she sighed heavily, a long pause stretching between us. "I don't know what I'm going to do." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window, watching the sun sink low over the horizon as I let the weight of her words settle in. This was it. This was the moment where everything came full circle, where the tables had turned in a way that even she couldn't deny. For years, she had justified taking from me to give to Mark, had dismissed my feelings, had told me that I didn't need help because I had a husband, because I had built a life without relying on her. Now, when she was at her lowest, when she needed someone to step in and be her safety net, there was only one person she could turn to. And she knew it. "That sounds really difficult, Mom," I said finally, keeping my voice neutral, refusing to give her an inch. There was a long silence, the kind that stretched with unsaid words, the kind that carried the weight of an unspoken expectation. "I was hoping you could help," she finally admitted, the words quiet, almost embarrassed, as if she knew how absurd the request really was. "Just a little, just enough to get through this, to keep things from getting worse." I let the silence linger, let her sit in the discomfort of it, let her feel the weight of what she was asking, let her realize that this time, the answer wouldn't come so easily. Because I wasn't the daughter she had raised to be obedient. And I wasn't going to save her the way she had expected me to. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and something else, something stale, something lifeless, the kind of scent that lingered in places where hope had long since begun to wither. The walls were an unforgiving shade of beige, the kind of color that made everything feel colder than it already was, and the sound of distant beeping machines mixed with the occasional murmur of nurses passing by in the hallway. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, frail in a way that unsettled me, though I wouldn't admit it, not even to myself. She had always carried herself with an air of sharp authority, always spoken with the confidence of someone who expected her words to be law, but sitting there in that stiff hospital bed, wrapped in blankets that seemed too large for her thin frame, she looked powerless. She glanced up when I walked in, her eyes flickering with something unreadable before she forced a weak smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sarah," she breathed, as if my presence alone was enough to bring relief, as if she truly believed that I was here out of love, out of concern, out of a sense of duty that she had spent years trying to instill in me. "I wasn't sure if you were going to come." I set my purse down on the chair near the bed, taking my time, letting the silence stretch between us just long enough for her to start shifting uncomfortably. "Of course, I came," I said finally, my voice calm, composed, betraying nothing of what I actually felt. "You asked me to." Her expression faltered for a brief moment, something flickering in her gaze that almost looked like hesitation before she forced another smile, this one thinner, more careful. "It means a lot," she murmured, folding her hands in her lap, her fingers twitching slightly as if she were debating what to say next. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about things, about the past, about mistakes, about everything that's happened." I tilted my head slightly, watching her with an expression I knew was unreadable, giving nothing away, waiting to see where she was going with this. "Have you?" I said, my tone light but distant. "That's surprising. You never struck me as someone who liked to dwell on the past." She sighed heavily, closing her eyes for a brief moment before reopening them, her gaze settling on mine with the kind of intensity that once might have made me uneasy. "I know I've made mistakes," she admitted, the words sounding rehearsed, as if she had practiced them in her head before I even arrived. "I know things weren't always fair, but Sarah, you have to understand. I did what I thought was best." I almost laughed, almost let the bitterness spill over right then and there, but I swallowed it down, letting the silence stretch again, making her sit in it, making her feel the weight of her own words. "You thought it was best to take my wedding fund and give it to Mark?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, my voice still eerily calm, still devoid of the anger she was probably expecting. "You thought it was best to put his future ahead of mine over and over again? You thought it was best to let me fend for myself while you handed him everything on a silver platter?" Her lips parted slightly as if she had expected me to say something else, something softer, something more forgiving, but when she saw the look in my eyes, the carefully controlled patience, the unwavering steel beneath my calm, she hesitated. "I was trying to help him," she said, her voice weaker now, her conviction cracking. "You don't understand, Sarah." I understand perfectly," I interrupted, my voice cutting through hers like a blade. "I understand that you made a choice. You chose Mark over and over again, and you never once considered how that affected me. You told yourself it was because he needed it more, because he was your son, because he was struggling, but the truth is, you just didn't care what it cost me as long as he got what he wanted." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the blanket as she looked away for a moment, her breathing slightly uneven now. "Sarah," she said again, quieter this time, almost hesitant, almost as if she were afraid of what I might say next. "I don't want to fight with you, sweetheart. That's not why I asked you here." I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms, my expression unreadable. "Then why did you ask me here, Mom?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Go ahead. Say what you really want to say." She hesitated for only a second before sighing again, shifting in the bed, her hands now wringing the blanket between her fingers. "I need help," she admitted finally, the words coming out almost reluctantly. "The hospital bills they're more than I can handle. The treatments, the medications, everything is piling up faster than I can keep up with, and I don't have any options left." I said nothing. She inhaled slowly, shakily, her gaze searching mine for something, for a sign of sympathy, of softness, of the daughter she had once been able to manipulate so easily. "I was hoping you could help, just a little," she continued, her voice now laced with something dangerously close to desperation. "I know things haven't always been easy between us, but you're doing well, And I smiled then, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that wasn't warm, wasn't reassuring, wasn't the kind she was hoping for. Ask Mark, I said simply, my voice calm, almost gentle. Her face froze, her entire body going rigid as the words settled over her like a death sentence. Sarah, she whispered, her voice barely audible, the color draining from her already pale face. I shrugged, still holding that same unreadable smile, still keeping my expression carefully neutral. I mean, you always said he needed the money more than I did, right? I continued, my tone light, almost amused. So, I'm sure he'll be happy to return the favor. That is, if he even has anything left to give. The silence that followed was deafening. She opened her mouth as if to argue, as if to say something, anything, but nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, she had no words, no defense, no excuses, just the cold, harsh reality that the sun she had placed above everything, above me, above logic, above fairness, had nothing left to give her. For the first time in her life, she had to live with the consequences of the choices she had made. And I had never felt lighter. My mother's face was a canvas of disbelief, a mixture of desperation, anger, and something close to fear, though she would never admit it, not even now, not even with her entire world collapsing around her. She had always believed, with unwavering certainty, that I would never abandon her, that no matter what she had done, no matter how much she had taken from me, no matter how many times she had chosen Mark over me, I would always be there, waiting in the background, ready to step in when she needed me most. But for the first time in her life, she was beginning to realize that the well she had drawn from so carelessly had finally run dry. Sarah, please, she whispered, her voice shaking, her hands gripping the thin hospital blanket as if holding onto something tangible could stop everything from slipping away. You can't just turn your back on me like this. I'm your mother. I tilted my head slightly, studying her, watching the way her breathing grew uneven, the way her fingers trembled, the way her lips parted slightly as if she were still trying to come up with the right words. The right combination of guilt and obligation that would make me fold the way I always had before. But I wasn't that girl anymore, and she wasn't the unshakable force she had once been. And Mark was your favorite, I said simply, my voice smooth, unwavering, free of anger, free of anything that might give her the satisfaction of thinking she had gotten under my skin. So why don't you ask him? Her breath hitched, just slightly, just enough for me to notice, just enough for me to know that she had no real response, no valid argument, no excuse that would hold up against the undeniable truth of what she had done. She had spent her entire life making sure Mark had everything he needed, ensuring that he was always taken care of, that he never had to struggle, that he never had to learn the painful but necessary lesson that the rest of us had. Choices have consequences, and nothing in this world comes without a price. And now, here she was, sitting in a hospital bed with bills she couldn't afford, a son who had drained every resource she had, and a daughter who had finally learned how to say no. Sarah, I know I made mistakes, she started, her voice wavering, her eyes wet with the kind of tears that once might have broken me, that once might have made me reconsider, that once might have made me believe she truly regretted the things she had done. I know I didn't always do right by you, but I am still your mother and I need you. I exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch between us, letting her feel the weight of my indifference, letting her sit in the very emptiness she had created between us over the years. No, Mom, I said finally, my voice soft but firm, my words cutting through the air with the kind of finality that left no room for argument. You don't need me. You need money. There's a difference. Her lips parted slightly, a breathless sound escaping her, something between a sob and a gasp, something that told me she had finally begun to understand. Sarah, please, she tried again, her voice breaking now, the raw desperation slipping through the cracks of whatever pride she had left. I don't have anywhere else to turn. I gave her a long, slow look, my gaze tracing the lines on her face, the years of choices and consequences settling into her skin like an artist's final strokes on a painting that could never be undone. Maybe you should have thought about that, I said simply, my tone still calm, still distant, still completely unshaken. Maybe you should have thought about that before you made it so clear who mattered more to you. She let out a choked sob then, her hands shaking as she reached for me, as if touching me would somehow undo everything, as if a mother's touch, after all these years, could erase the past and rewrite the future. But I didn't move, didn't step closer, didn't give her the comfort she was so desperately grasping for. Sarah, she wept, her shoulders shaking now, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. I am begging you. I nodded slowly, as if considering, as if giving her words real thought, as if there was still a chance, even a sliver, that I might cave the way she had always expected me to. And then, with a slow, deliberate smile, I shook my head. You made your bed, I said quietly, the final nail in the coffin, the final truth she could no longer run from. Now lie in it. I turned before she could respond, before she could try one last time to dig her claws into me, before she could reach for me with those desperate hands, before she could say anything that might make me hesitate, might make me second-guess the decision I had spent years preparing myself to make. I walked out of the room without looking back, without letting myself feel anything other than the cold, distant satisfaction of knowing that for the first time in my life, I had won. There was no rage left, no sadness, no lingering resentment eating away at me, no aching desire for an apology that would never come, no false hope that maybe, just maybe, she would finally see me as more than an afterthought. I walked down the hallway, past the nurses, past the patients, past the people who still carried the weight of their own burdens, and with every step, I felt lighter, as if the chains that had bound me to her expectations had finally shattered. As if the years of being second best, of being overlooked, of being nothing more than an inconvenience in my own mother's eyes had finally come to an end. By the time I reached my car, the sky had darkened, the streetlights casting long shadows against the pavement, the world moving forward as it always did, as if nothing significant had just happened, as if everything had not just changed in a way that could never be undone. I slid into the driver's seat, exhaling slowly, my fingers gripping the wheel, my heartbeat steady, my mind clear in a way it hadn't been in years. And as I pulled away from the hospital, leaving my mother and Mark to deal with the mess they had created, I realized something I had never truly believed before. I was free,